Hi everybody, happy holidays 2011. This is my annual holiday blog post, and it's based on the holiday card that my wife and I put together for our family. This is a long-running tradition that my wife and I have where we dress up for some goofy characters as Halloween, and then we turn that into a holiday card. And once we have kids, we of course incorporated our kids into this. So I've also started another tradition that is to do a blog post around the creation of the card. And my wife is a graphic designer, so she does any 2D work, and I handle the 3D stuff. So if there's any kind of 3D element involved, which there usually is, then I'll build that and render it in Maya. So this year I was Andy Warhol and my wife was Edie Sedgwick. And if you're not familiar with Edie Sedgwick, she was Andy Warhol's muse back in the 1960s and kind of one of his inspirations. And then our kids, of course, are incorporated as well. My daughter is Marilyn Monroe. They're both art objects, obviously. My son being Campbell's tomato soup can. So anyway, this was our holiday card this year. Just so you know, like I said, it's a long-running tradition. We've been doing this since 1998. I know it's kind of silly, but it's fun. We enjoy it. So we've been a variety of things, ranging from Kiss to Gilligan and Marianne to Popeye and Olive Oil to Hall & Oates to the Super Family and so on. So anyway, without going into too much of my past, let's move on and I'll talk about how we created the card. So as I said, I've got kind of a tradition for doing a blog post based on the card, talking about the elements that I created in Maya. So what I did in Maya this year is pretty straightforward. I basically built an environment or a background for us to exist in. So these are actually cards. Actually, I've got those referenced. These are actually cards. That's a card holding an image of my wife, and then this, of course, is a card holding an image of me. These were just photographs that we took independently of one another, trying to use the same camera angle as best we could. And then basically position these on cards and rendered a background and composited the foreground on top of that. So a couple of things we did. One is we of course built a background, and I built some basic frames for the kids. And then I also built some stand-in objects that would basically serve as shadows and reflections. So these are really just rudimentary kind of dummy objects that have the basic shape, form, and color of what you see in the cards. So when we render out the background, I just wanted to make sure that we look planted, on the floor, so that you see a bit of our reflection in the floor and you see a bit of our shadow in the background. So I'll show that, the actual rendered elements in a bit. What I'm actually going to ultimately show on the Maya side, though, is this fancy little parquet floor that I created. Now, when I created this, I wanted it to look like a gallery space, like it's in a museum or something, or a gallery. And typically in those environments, you have these kind of wood tiled floors, these parquet floors. And so this was actually created with a procedural texture as part of the Substance bonus tools pack. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Substance, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the bonus tools that you can download for free. But first, actually, I'm going to show just kind of the end result of this on the Photoshop side, and then I'll come back to Substance. Actually, before I go into Photoshop, I want to show quickly just a real simple overview of how I rendered this out. So like I said, these are stand-ins for shadows and reflections. I chose to use Turtle, actually, mainly because it's really fast and it's really easy to use, and particularly for creating still images, I wanted to get something up and running pretty quickly without having to futz around with the intricacies of middle ray. So all I did here is basically went in and I turned on global illumination and set my primary global illumination to a final gather. Tweaks a few settings. I'm not going to go into all the details. Tweaked a few final gather settings, and then also I created a global illumination environment. And I just created a skylight with a simple kind of cool color, and then I've got some direct lights that have a warmer color to kind of complement that. What I did is I rendered out one pass with the final gather, and like I said, it renders very quickly in Turtle. So if I just render this out, you can start to see really quickly kind of what that final gather pass is going to look like. So here you can see that just the final gather, with a little bit of the shadowing from the stand-in objects. You'll notice the reflection in the floor there. But I also rendered out another pass with more direct shadow, so heavier direct shadows. And then I rather than trying to render it all out at once, I like to have a little bit more control over how those shadows get blended. So here's kind of a low-res, crude example of just what I get with the final gather pass, where you can see some soft shadowing where we're kind of standing, and then some soft shadowing around the frames. And then if I load up the shadow image, then this is an example of just getting the direct illumination with the hard shadows. So rather than massage and finesse these in Maya, I generally like to render out a pass of each and then kind of blend them together on the Photoshop side so that I have a little bit more direct control over the contribution of each of these shadows. And that's particularly for still images, not necessarily for moving images or sequences. So now let's move over to Photoshop. So then this is what we end up with in Photoshop. As you can see, we've got the Compton foreground with us, and then we have two backgrounds. Basically, we have the background with just the ambient occlusion, or rather the final gather, and then we have the background with the hard shadows. And I could finesse these hard shadows in Maya, but that is tedious and time consuming. So oftentimes it's easier if you're doing a still image just to render out the pass and then just use some simple tools in Photoshop to start to blend that in. So I'll just use, for instance, my erase, and I'll just go in and actually start to, kind of fade these shadows in so that I can get kind of a decay in the shadow across the length of the shadow so that it looks a little more natural. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but you get the basic idea. And so that just starts to look a little bit more like an actual shadow once we get our foreground pasted on there. And then, of course, my wife goes in and adds the fonts and text and whatnot, or any 2D elements that we need to add. So with all that said, again, the main point of this post is to actually talk about substance. So let's move into substance and do a quick overview before I get into the details of the bonus pack.